So Nicholas O'Brien is an artist and researcher, makes video games, digital animations, and installations addressing civic history, urban infrastructure, and overlooked narratives of technology and labor. Um, he currently lives in Brooklyn and is assistant professor in 3D design and game development at Stevens Institute of Technology. So thank you very much, Nicholas.
Cool, thank you. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for the Game Art Engine crew for putting together on this fantastic event, and also for inviting me to speak with y'all. Before getting started, I want to say today would be a really good day to arrest the cops that murdered Breonna Taylor.
It's very quiet.
I'll try to turn up. How's that? My initial proposal for this talk was to discuss how using handmade and analog materials and independent and experimental game artists is a gesture in and of itself of working against mainstream gaming culture. I proposed looking at Ritual of the Moon by Kara Stone, Rekha Ramanchandra, and Julia Gingrich, Small Talk by Pale Room, Sacramento by Delphine Furneaux, aka D-Ziv, and Gora Goa by Jason Roberts as examples of artists and designers, quote unquote, returning to analog materials in order to stand against the good graphics tyranny of digital photorealism. My hypothesis at the time was that making games with handmade gestures and materials deprioritize tech and leverage labor and craft. These gestures were significant within a broader network of indies because the labor involved in making them forced audiences to recognize craft not merely as aesthetic, but also as critical or conceptual content. I speculated that these gestures not only indicated authenticity and vulnerability from the maker, but also an attempt at reconciling some of the larger systemic woes of the games industry. But the past several months have shown those problems, latent racism, sexual misconduct, homophobia and transphobia, bigotry, and exploitation of workers, to name just a few, are not exclusive to games at all, and that these projects are contending with issues well beyond medium-centric concerns. Using analog materials is not merely an aesthetic gesture. It is a defiant act of working against the capitalist constraints of games as entertainment. It takes all the rhetoric of optimization, automation, precision, and streamlining that have ingrained themselves into Western culture and turns those mantras on their heads. A game incorporating non-digital craft is an act of subversion, an act that questions the logic of quote-unquote game making as a form of producing entertainment. It is a gesture that also questions the logic of game engines, since employing analog processes in a digital interface necessitates an act of intensive and careful labor. Transcribing, transmuting, or transcoding the analog into a digital interface is inherently a process of meticulous concentration, since the procedures to do so are inherently lossy. The intentional labor, care, and focus is not cost-effective or timely, mainstays of quote-unquote effective game design, and design goals shared by many game engines themselves. Handmade gestures are anti-accelerationist and anti-corporate. And it is this belief that inspired me to use graphite and charcoal animation in my own project, The Last Survey. I'm going to show a trailer quickly of that project. Just let me know if everybody can see this okay. So as a brief synopsis, the last survey is set in a not so distant future where you play the role of a geologist returning from a year-long research trip for a global mining company. You found that the Earth's metals and minerals are rapidly declining, and as a result, we won't be able to sustain growing demands for green technology and digital hardware components. As you navigate the convo with your CEO employer, you try to negotiate between reporting the dire truth and understanding systems of power beyond your control. Almost immediately into the production of this project, I realized that the content must be intertwined with this production. The visuals of the game needed to speak directly to the supply chains it meant to scrutinize. Granted, charcoal and graphite are not part of the same rare earth minerals that are mined for motherboards and solar paneling, but the symbolic link these materials had was a deliberate decision early on TLS's design. Each animation is drawn frame by frame using loose sketches drawn on top of a combination of 3D model and photographic reference imagery. These sketches are traced over using graphite and charcoal on a light table in 8 to 15 frame sequences. The individual drawings were then photographed using a DSLR camera and brought into digital software for color correction and contrast adjustment. I would align each frame using imprecise registration marks, using a combination of opacity layers and blending options. I found that making the game a purely digital representation, purely digital representation was not only alienating, but also felt too clean for the ambiguity of the player character of the narrative. The charcoal and graphite animation cells took almost 2 years to complete, and during this time, I contemplated using software, gone machine learning, and some other automated procedure for quickening the production time. But each time I toyed with that idea, I felt succumbing to the pressure of expediting this process was giving into the nagging publish early and often demands. In resisting that temptation, I can see now how much more detailed the work is, even when its imperfections are most evident. About 1.5 years of drawing, photographing, and bringing my animations into software, I realized that the process of making this game was as much about my own misgivings about using proprietary software as it was about designing a narrative that criticizes eco-exploitation. At a certain point, I stopped caring about whether or not the animations I made followed in lockstep with the narrative and started caring more about how the processes of drawing mirrored the year-long meticulous journey the protagonists undertook as part of their survey. In many ways, the attention to detail and insistence on doing things the hard way were unwittingly echoed in the narrative itself. I suppose it's true what they say that writers always write a bit of themselves into their stories. And in closing, in writing the character, I tried to present a perspective of someone working through their uncertain culpability, employed by a system of oppression and hoping to bend it towards progressive outcomes. Though the process of making these drawings, I wrestled with the ways I was participating in a system I had fundamentally problems with. Though I don't think making the game the way that I did absolves me in participating in selling my game on Steam, a platform that protects alt-right, anti-LGBTQ, and racist users, I like to imagine that the aesthetic gestures of TLS align with its critique of corporate greed, globalist apathy, and extractionist accelerationism. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really awesome. Maybe we could get some questions for Nicholas while James is setting up. Do we have any? Although James looks like he's set up. Anything from Twitch chat or?
There isn't, but I thought it would be really interesting to ask about when you were drawing the game, what tools did you use?
Drawing the game itself with tool, I'd use graphite and charcoal. So,
yeah.
And then the kind of first chapter of the game is digital line drawings, and I just did that in Photoshop.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that if it's not clear, the kind of more grainy and how could you say, like, rougher drawings in the trailer that you just saw, and also in the video that you see in some of the videos that you see up here, those are photographed individual frames of charcoal and graphite drawings on just like regular old paper.
As you can tell from our symposium logo, we're big fans of bringing the analog into the digital.
Yeah, totally.
JP, do we have any Twitch chat questions?
Yeah, it looks like we got a couple questions over on Twitch. There's one person asking generally how detailed in terms of science and tech do you find you need to be for your research based off of the bit about depleted metals and stuff. And then there's one more, but I'll ask that after.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for the question. So TLS, or the last survey, is grounded in real-world studies by nickel and silver geoscientists and mineral analysts. And their kind of concerns are that we're approaching this point like that you could kind of call peak mineral, similar to peak oil, where the production demands of these rare earth metals are outpacing supply. And the concerns then in turn are that will kind of recreate geopolitical unrest and like neo-colonial practices for hoarding and extracting oil. So it's important to me to not misrepresent that research. But a lot of the game is also a character study of executive power and a kind of introspective look at how one engages in those relationships.
Cool. There's another question. It says, when it comes to distribution platforms, do you feel that there is an ethical model for them to follow, or is the complicity of the entire logistics chain, data centers, et cetera, too corrupt to be saved?
I think that this is like a really huge question for a lot of kind of like platform capitalism. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm an expert in dissecting what would or should be the kind of like best ethical model. I feel like I'm also maybe not in the best position to do that. Mostly because of my own like privileges and biases, and I wouldn't want to like enforce those or kind of like supplant those onto anyone else, I guess. But like maybe as a way of saying like what models do I think that are like worthwhile, I really commend itch.io's bundle that they put together to benefit various Black Lives Matter communities and organizations, two in particular. And I think that that's a way of kind of generating a conversation, at least, about what it means to distribute digital entertainment amidst like global and national crises. But yeah, I don't necessarily. I would just like kind of point to that as an instance in which, like a powerful instance that inspired me, but I wouldn't necessarily say that there's. I'm just thinking about your question. Sorry if I'm kind of staggering through this, but I'm really thinking about your question. So I wouldn't want to say like that there's necessarily one model, but that there's instances that have been inspirational to me like that.
Cool, thank you. There's one more here from Twitch, if we have time for it. There have been critical responses to TLS via Steam or elsewhere so far. Either to its, have there been critical responses? Either to its thematic concerns or to the non-digital aesthetics. There's a little addendum to it. Also, does the decision to distribute via Steam operate as an act of resistance, or is it intended as one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can see in the chat actually that's asked by Shane Mecklenburger, I think, and I really appreciate that question, Shane. I think there has been some really good critical responses to the last survey that are kind of like talking about how the game is trying to wrestle with like the apathy of global capitalism, and I've really appreciated some of the responses that I've gotten to it. One of the responses on Steam, though, was that the game itself is maybe like good and even-handed, but my social media presence is like alphabet soup and like anti-2A, which is like guns rights activism and stuff like that. And so as a result, my game should be panned, which is an interesting response. So it's kind of run the gamut. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question. I think people have been really focused on the thematic concerns. The thing actually that I think that I've gotten the most response about is that the last survey is a kind of choose your own adventure style game. It's a visual novel style game. And people are really wanting the decisions in the last survey to be way more consequential, or for them to telegraph their consequences way more like bluntly, as opposed to the nuanced way in which I had written the game. So the content is that you have these choices in the game, but those choices, it's unclear whether or not those choices have consequence. And my kind of like retort to that is like, that's kind of how conversations typically go. You don't know how your choices or the way that you respond to certain scenarios are going to telegraph into action. But that the criticism has been like, oh, in games that needs to be a lot more clear, which I think is, I don't know, I go back and forth on whether or not that's a valid argument.